An associate professor of political science at Occidental College, and Nick Gillespie, editor-in-chief of Reason TV and Reason.com. Carolyn, why does it seem that everybody in the government, except for Dennis Kucinich liberals and Ron Paul libertarians, seems to like war?
Well, I think that it's difficult to go against public opinion. I actually place the blame in the hands of the American public. We don't have constitutional literacy, and with the rise of mass media, we have given the president an inordinate amount of power to persuade us. And so I think it's very hard for Congress, which has been called the broken branch, to really stand against the president when he wants to push war measures through.
Nick Gillespie, the other night I asked that question to Charlie Rangel, the famously liberal, somewhat outrageous congressman from Harlem for the past 40 years. And he looked at me and he said, I won't imitate his voice, we like Barack Obama and we like all the other things he's done, so we're going to sort of let him get away with this one, and we can't stand Muammar Gaddafi. I mean, that is not an intellectually sound, legally acceptable, or constitutionally based reason for war.
No, it certainly isn't. And, you know, there's no question that the war fever goes back as far as human history. I mean, people, unfortunately, like war, and governments play to that all the time. I think it's true that we should have constitutional literacy. But, you know, these congressmen are not, you know, they're not cripples. They're not blind. They're not deaf. They're not lead-poisoned children or something. These are people who are paid to uphold the Constitution, and they ought to start doing it, or we ought to start voting more of them out next time around.
Carolyn, do you understand that people will give a president a pass because the target of the military is someone who is so hated as Muammar Gaddafi? Or would it be better that they stuck to the Constitution, lest this become a precedent for a future president to follow?
Well, I think it has become precedent, and that's a problem. And I think that it's a problem anytime you get away from the Constitution. But unfortunately, we do rally around the flag. We give the president carte blanche during times of crisis. And so if he says it's a crisis, then we tend to rally behind him, or hopefully at some point her. And that's a really big problem when it comes to how our country is supposed to function.
It is a really big problem, and I think that every major president in modern times has done this, has expanded the power of the imperial presidency at the expense of the legislative branch. Carolyn Heldman, Nick Gillespie, thank you very much for joining us. My final thoughts on all of this, especially the budget, after this. Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? Would you hire an employee who claimed he was saving you $38 billion when in reality he was costing you more money than in the previous year of your business, and you still needed to borrow $1 trillion just to stay afloat? You know what's coming tonight. The federal government and your money. Here we go again. I know this sounds ridiculous, but you should not be surprised. Shortly before midnight last Friday, President Obama, House of Representatives Speaker John Boehner, and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid announced that the White House and the Congress had reached a stunning deal on cutting the federal government budget by $38 billion. The president grumbled that the cuts were too deep, but he could live with them. Speaker Boehner grumbled that the cuts were not deep enough, but were better than what he originally sought. Senator Reid dispatched his favorite attack dog, that would be the personality-challenged New York Senator Chuck Schumer, to threaten that the Democrats would cut no longer, since the Republicans were controlled by extremists. That's the same Senator Schumer who revealed in a telephone call with reporters that he didn't know was being taped that the Senate Democratic Caucus, which is all of the Senate Democrats, had instructed him to refer to Tea Party Republicans as extremists. The begrudging joint announcement that a government shutdown had been averted came as a surprise at the last minute. And conventional wisdom has it that when you settle a dispute like this and each side is unhappy, you probably did a good job. But there's nothing conventional about this agreement. First, a little background. According to the Constitution and federal law and a 230-year-old tradition, the president proposes a budget sufficiently in advance of the fiscal year in which he wants to spend the money, and the House of Representatives approves, modifies, or disapproves. Then whatever the House has voted on goes to the Senate, then back to the House, then to the president for his signature. The process is supposed to produce a budget months in advance of the fiscal year, so that federal agencies, so that people who sell things to the government, so that the financial community will have time to prepare for what the government will spend. There is currently before the Congress two budget proposals. One is for the remainder of this fiscal year, which ends on September 30th, 2011. And the other is a budget for the fiscal year that begins the next day on October 1st. As you can see, the government is woefully late for the 2011 budget, since we are halfway through that fiscal year. It is for the remainder of this 2011 fiscal year that the so-called deal that cut $38 billion was struck. So, what did they cut $38 billion from? They cut it from what the president wanted to spend, and he wanted to spend far more in 2011 than he did spend in 2010. Thus, even with the so-called cut, spending for the remainder of 2011 will increase, not decrease. As Senator Rand Paul told me on this show last night, only in Washington can a budget that spends more than it did the year before and with a larger deficit be portrayed as cutting. He's right. And the Republicans who boasted that they cut $38 billion and the Democrats who condemned them for doing so are all playing a shell game. America, we are at the precipice of a very deep abyss. It is an enormous hole that needs to be filled with $14.3 trillion. And the president just wants to dig that hole deeper. Since Barack Obama became president, he has increased the debt by $4 trillion. In the next 6 months, he wants to increase the debt by another trillion. And in the 2012 fiscal year, he wants to borrow another $1.7 trillion. America, the White House, and its enablers in Congress are out of control. They have tricked even well-intentioned folks into believing that the economy will collapse if we don't borrow more. That's nonsense. The economy will tank if we do borrow more. It is utterly immoral, illegal, and unconstitutional for the government to borrow when it has neither the intention nor the means to repay the loan. Let me modify that. The government does repay its loans. It just does it with more loans. Would you hire people who run the federal government to run your business or your household or even your checkbook? The answer is obvious, and that leaves another obvious question. Why are these people running the government? Tonight on Freedom Watch at 8 p.m. Eastern on the Fox Business Network, I will go toe-to-toe with Bill Kristol on the president's warmongering in Libya. From New York, my friends, defending freedom. So long, America.